37% of families with young children in America are in poverty. That's the highest percent we've seen since records have been kept. 37% of American families with young children are in poverty. And yet, we have now at the top 1%, raking in over 20% of total national income per year. That is higher than it's been since 1928. And we've got the top 1% with 35% of total wealth in this country. That's the highest it's been since 1922. You see what the radical right, the regressive forces in America, you see what they're doing, where they want to take us? They want to take us back to the 1920s, or back to the 1880s, 1890s, the Gilded Age, or back to the Stone Age. And we cannot let them. The weapon that they are using is not just the big lie. The weapon they are using is also demoralization and cynicism. In other words, I can't tell you how many people come up to me, you know, because I am very short and pretty obvious. People who I don't know come up to me in airports and they say, yeah, you were, what's your name? You were, George Stephanopoulos. I don't know. They cannot remember. But they say, but they look at me and they know that I was part of the Clinton administration and they say, isn't it awful? Or they say to me, how are we going to survive? How are we going to make it? Or on streets, they come up to me and they say, my family is really hurting. Or they say, have you ever seen anything this bad? And after tens or 20s or hundreds of people come up to me like this, I tell you, it can get a little bit demoralizing. But the worst thing is when people say nothing can be done. But when people say nothing can be done, when they were so cynical about the ability to change the direction of the country, then we know the other side has won. Their number one weapon is to so discredit government, so discredit the capacity of us working together through the institutions of government given to us by the Constitution and the Founding Fathers, so discredit them. I mean, whether it's lies about weapons of mass destruction, or it's the response to Katrina, or it's a huge fiasco over raising the debt limit, should never have been even an issue. But you see, it paints it all in America's mind as a fiasco, as government doesn't work any longer. Government is for the big guys. Government is for the powerful. It's for the privileged. I no longer have any say. I cannot do anything about it. And that demoralization and that cynicism is their biggest weapon, because if people really believe nothing can change and they can have no part in changing it, then that is a self-fulfilling prophecy. And that is why so much of what we do, so much of what you do, so much of taking back the American dream is taking back our power and confidence in that power. You see, people, you know, right now, there are demonstrations all over this country, on Wall Street, 70 other cities. 70 cities. And you know, and if you listen to the media, first of all, the media are not even playing it. But if they are, what are they saying? Well, this is a movement. It's not really a movement. There's no direction. There's no head. There's nothing. They don't have a plan. Let me tell you something. These demonstrations are the small tip of an iceberg. They are an iceberg of discontent. And I say, demonstrate like mad. Let, because that wakes up others to the possibility of change. Now, when Barack Obama was elected, I was one of those who supported him, and I was delighted. I mean, I couldn't believe it. He walked in. I had a meeting of his advisors shortly after he was elected in Chicago. He walked in the room, and I could barely contain myself. He walked around to all of his advisors, shook their hands. He came to me, and I actually started crying. I felt like such an asshole. I mean, here's the new president of the United States, and I was a blithering idiot. But I was crying because of him. And I was also crying because a black man had become president of the United States. And like many of you, I'm not content. I wish he had done much more. I don't like the fact that he has compromised or tried to compromise with the other side, because there's no compromising with the other side. But let me tell you this. I've been in Washington enough to know that you can have the best people here, but if people outside Washington are not organized and mobilized and energized in a continuing basis, nothing good happens here. When all those people come up to me and say, oh, it's awful what's going on in Washington, you know what I say back? I say, what are you doing about it? What are you doing about it? Because I think that some of us, many of us, have let President Obama down. I think that if we were more, and if we are in the future after today, more mobilized and more energized and better organized and pushing harder, we will get what Americans need to get. And that is the heart of taking back the American dream. Now, I've got just one more thing to say, and then I'm going to turn it over to you and your questions. You want me to just continue on? No. No. I just got one more thing to say, and this is important. Remember when I opened by talking about the progressive forces and the regressive forces in America, and how the progressive forces always win? Well, my first entree into politics, or at least the key thing that propelled me personally into a life of politics and writing and agitation and making a ruckus and doing whatever I could, happened during the civil rights movement. You see, I was always very short. Let me confess this to you. And so as a kid, I was very short, and I would get beat up a lot by the big kids. It wasn't fun getting beat up at the bus stop. I didn't like to do that. So here's what I did. I made alliances with some of the big fellas who would protect me. I had a protection racket. And I made alliances, and some of them were older, but they all kind of cared about me, and they also didn't want the bullies to prevail. And then the summer of 1964, one of my protectors, one of my wonderful protectors named Mickey, Michael Schwerner, he was down registering voters in the South, and the sheriff of Neshoba County and others took Mickey out of his car, and two others, one black and a white, the three of them took the three of them and tortured them and murdered them. And when the man who had been my protector from the bullies was tortured and killed by the bullies who wanted to prevent black people from voting. I said to myself, the most important thing any of us can do is to protect the powerless, to make sure that the people with power, the people with privilege, we're not going to use their power and privilege to bully anybody, and to give ordinary working people and the poor a voice so that they would not be bullied ever again. And that but here is where my confidence comes from. Here is where my confidence comes from. The progressive forces, well, look, what happened? The civil rights struggle and the anti-Vietnam struggle. What happened? The darkest days in the 1950s with regard to McCarthyism and the blacklists. What happened with regard to the Great Depression and the Second World War? Every time this country has really been challenged, every time the regressive forces look like they are going to win, the progressive forces rally. That's been the history. That is the history of the United States. A history, 2 steps forward, 1 step back. A history of progressive forces fighting the regressive forces, but ultimately winning out because Americans in their hearts are not just progressive, but they are sensible. If they understand the truth, and that is a big if, but it is more a when they understand the truth, we roll up our sleeves and get on with what has to be done. This terrible jobs and wage depression, and it is a depression, continues for most Americans. There is a small group that doesn't want to do anything about it, that rejects any common sense solution, that just says no. The nabobs of negativism. But Americans are not going to stand for it. We are going to say to those with power and privilege, no more bullying. Thank you. Okay. So now, it's time for your questions. Not your speeches,